Welcome to the Point Loma Presbyterian Church podcast, and here we are in Studio One. For those of you on YouTube, you can see it. For those of you not, just know it's a great space. We've done a lot of work on it, so we're pretty excited about it. But we are here because we are going to be starting not at the beginning, but we're going to start at the end. We're going to be talking about the book of Revelation. I'm with up here Pastor Karla, and this is inspired by your women's Bible study, but it goes before that. So how are we going to get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting last year when I was deciding whether to do the women's Bible study, and of course I came to you because you're my theological equal here.
Well, minus languages, but yes, thank you.
And you said that you had done this Revelation with your youth group at one point, and it was really inspiring. And so we started talking, and you kind of became where I would throw off my feedback or get feedback from when I was preparing this study. And so I think that launched into wanting to do this podcast because I think your perspective on this is also really interesting.
Yeah. I had a student in high school that was always like, can we do Revelation? Because she was really into like Left Behind, which we'll get into, I'm sure. But she was like really into that. She was like, can we study Revelation? Can we study Revelation? And I remember at seminary, I had a New Testament professor who was like, talking about Revelation, and after him talking about it, he was like, it's not as exciting as Left Behind. I mean, like the way we've studied it in America, it's like it's really not that exciting. It's kind of, and we'll talk about it in depth. But, weirdly, but it is exciting, but not in the way we think.
Yeah. So weirdly, I grew up in a church that was a small Baptist church in rural America, and Revelation was a huge part of my early years in Christianity. And so I went to one of those churches where on Sunday nights, it felt like every Sunday night we would go to church and there would be a timeline on the wall of the book of Revelation. We were obsessed with the book of Revelation. So it's made me not want to dive into it as an adult. But I have to say the study I did last year with the women was life-changing for me. So I would love to hear, even as we start, what are some of your experiences with Revelation besides your time with the youth program, or maybe including that? What are your thoughts about it?
Well, like growing up, I grew up in an Episcopal church. I became a Christian, went to a Baptist church because the girls were good looking in the youth group. So I think we talked about that a little bit. But in the Southern Baptist church is when they, you would hear these words about end times and these kind of rapture and introduced to some of these like words. But I never really got into Revelation necessarily. They never preached on Revelation, which was weird. And then I went to college, and I remember that our pastor there was doing a study on the book of Jude for like a whole year. How do you do that? But that's a whole nother podcast. But anyway, he was doing a study on the book of Jude, and one Sunday he goes, turn to the last book of the Bible, which is Jude. And everybody's like, what? And everybody was like,
weird.
He was like, now most of you think it's Revelation, but for my Bible, it stops at Jude because Revelation, he was just basically like dismissing that. Revelation is kind of weird and crazy. We don't, not that we don't talk about it, but my Bible, I don't really get into that because so his Bible ended at Jude, which I thought was kind of funny. But so that was kind of my study of it. And then I never really, it was always kind of this end of the Bible book that I never really cared about or studied about, never was inspired to look into it. And then it was when I went to seminary and we looked at it in our New Testament class, I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then when the student in our youth group kept saying, can we do Revelation? Can we do Revelation? I was like, okay, let me look into it. And then it was just like mind blowing.
Well, I think what's interesting that you brought up about that your Bible, or that this guy's Bible ended at Jude, is honestly that's a lot of the perspective on Revelation, I think, for a lot of American Christians or modern day Christians or Protestant Christians in particular.
Right. But they talk about a lot of stuff in Revelation without really
actually reading Revelation. Yeah. So I just want to let our listeners know that there is not an original thought being discussed here during our time. And we are using several important resources. And number one is this book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, written by Michael Gorman. If you want to pick it up, I'm also referencing a lot of Eugene Peterson stuff. His book called Reversed Thunder is really interesting on its perspective of Revelation. I wouldn't call it a commentary, but it offers a wide understanding. It's so interesting.
Okay.
We've also we've both listened to the Voxology Podcast. They did the book of Revelation and just a lot of other sources.
You don't know who we are, but shout out to you.
Shout out.
You have really good stuff.
But I think it's kind of interesting because Revelation is probably one, out of all the books of the Bible, is probably either the one most rejected and not thought of at all or most obsessed over. And I thought it'd be funny in this book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, there's a couple quotes.
Okay.
I would love for you to interact with them as
All
we
right.
begin about the book of Revelation over time.
Okay.
Martin Luther, who was the guy that basically started the Protestant church, said that Revelation was neither apostolic nor prophetic. I can in no way detect that the Holy Spirit produced it. Interesting thing about Martin Luther and his contemporary John Calvin. John Calvin wrote a commentary in every book of the Bible except for Revelation.
No way.
Isn't that
That's
crazy?
crazy. Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
I think Luther also said that it doesn't reveal anything about Christ.
Right.
And you're like, anyway. So.
Which will be interesting during this podcast
yeah.
because we would say the exact opposite. Thomas Paine, you might know him, the American Thomas Paine, put that Revelation is a book of riddles that requires a revelation to explain it.
Totally, yeah. Yeah.
Friedrich Nietzsche, the most famous atheist of all time, said that Revelation is the most rabid outburst of vindictiveness in all recorded history. I just think it's interesting that people outside the church also have a perspective on Revelation.
And is that because of they've heard people from inside the church giving perspective and they've kind of
totally
agreed? Anyway.
John the Divine, who I think is really interesting. He's a holy dude. Said that just as Jesus had to have a Judas, so did there have to be a Revelation in the New Testament. People hate this book.
Do we hang the book anyway?
Probably one of my favorites is the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who said that Revelation was the curious record of the visions of a drug addict. I guess we will find out, won't we?
Yes.
So speaking of that, today we're not even opening the book of Revelation. It's going to be a few weeks before we even get there because as we've been studying this book, you just
have to know the context.
Right.
So
much context. And so I do think it's kind of interesting that we are Protestant, both of us. We're both Presbyterian at this point. But that Luther nor Calvin actually thought this Revelation should be a part of the canon. They just thought, we don't understand it, so why bother?
Right.
What do you think about that?
Should
we throw out things that we don't understand? Like, why bother?
Well, and who put it in and what gives Luther and Calvin the authority to take it out, right? I mean, how I understand the canon, it's not just like somebody sitting there and writing saying, I hope this gets into the canon. They're writing down stories that were being told in the culture just to have them, written down, or for like Paul, it's like letters to a particular people.
Totally.
Or Peter, whatever. It's letters to particular people. He's not going, this is going to be in the Bible someday. So I'm sure, but it just got, these stories and these letters got passed around and communities kind of agreed upon them, and so they were like, let's canonize them. That's kind of how I understand.
And who is this Luther guy and Calvin guy to decide?
And then they come, hundreds of years later, and we'll go, let's just toss it.
Yeah, it actually makes me want to study it more.
Right.
If it's like, why bother? It makes me want to study it.
Now, did the early church, speaking of the canon, did the early church have trouble with Revelation? I mean, there was...
I think so. I don't know. No. Well, we're going to get into that, so let's not even go there. But today we're going to talk about the Revelation has been used or at least discussed in our world, whether knowingly or unknowingly. It's having a huge impact on our world today.
For sure.
And so before we even get to the book of Revelation, as we talked about, I think one of the major problems with Revelation and its understanding is because we don't understand the genre, which we're going to talk about next week.
Okay.
But today we're going to discuss the 4 basic overarching themes, or I guess interpretations, historical interpretations of this book, and we're going to interact with them a little bit. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay.
Great. Let's do it.
So the first theme is what is called the preterist view. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Sounds good.
Preterist? Sound good to you?
Yeah. Let's go preterist.
Preter or preter, whatever, Preter means past in Latin. And this was probably the most held view of the early church early on in the book of Revelation, or early on when Revelation was first put in the canon. And the idea of it is there's really 2 views among preterists. But the idea is that the book of Revelation has already been fully completed. Everything in it is history.
Okay.
It's past. So it may not have been, it wasn't history at the time it was written. It was forward thinking for those that lived at the time, but for us, it would be past.
Okay.
So there's 2 groups among this group. There's full preterists and partial preterists. And full preterists believe that everything in the book of Revelation happened before 70 AD.
Okay. The fall of the temple.
Right, the fall of the temple. Partial preterists believe that most of Revelation, took place before the fall of AD or the fall of the temple, but that the last few chapters of the book of Revelation were still to come. They're still futuristic. And so that was the most widely held belief for a long time in the church. I think that stands, so that's the first one. This is really, what's really crucial to the preterist view of Revelation or their understanding is the date when it was written.
Right.
So if it was about the past or about 70 AD, that means John would have had to wrote this book before 70 AD.
Right.
And most modern theologians would date the book of Revelation later.
Right.
And so that's where it becomes kind of a question mark, right? That being said, we'll get to the point of it later. Okay, so that's the first view, preterist.
Okay.
What do you think about that, first of all?
Good. Keep going.
Keep going. Okay. The second view is what's known as...
I don't know. I wouldn't say it's before 70, but I would say it's after, but that's anyway.
Well, we're getting there.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay, the second view is the idealistic view, or sometimes called the spiritualist view, or the spiritual view. And the spiritual realm, this is a view that understands really the book of Revelation is outside of time. It is not connected to history at all, actually, to tangible events. So the spiritual realm, it understands that the spiritual realm supersedes all time and is going on parallel to what's happening now in our life. And the Bible really kind of speaks to this throughout the Bible, that there are powers and principalities happening even as we live our daily lives. And so this view, this understanding, the spiritualist view, that this uses the allegorical method to interpret the book of Revelation. So in other words, what's allegory?
Story, right?
Story.
Yeah.
Well, it's more than story.
It's a story. What is allegory?
What is allegory?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Good
Anybody know
question.
English?
So the difference between, I guess, allegory and symbolism in a writing is that symbolism can take on different meanings based upon, I guess, what you impart into that symbolism. Where an allegory can only have one meaning. So in the book of Revelation, if the dragon character is the Roman Empire, which we don't,
Caesar
or whatever, it can only and ever forever be Caesar.
Okay,
do you know what I mean? It can never be something else.
Right.
It's a one-to-one thing. So
I gotcha.
This allegorical approach to Revelation was really introduced also very early on in church life. First by Origen, back in the early first, second century.
Right.
And it was really made prominent by Augustine, my least favorite early father. Do you know why he's my least favorite?
Why?
Have you ever read his Confessions? The Confessions of Augustine?
I feel like I have. I feel like I did, but maybe
I
probably had to, but I probably was like,
oh my gosh, this guy was so depressing. If you've ever read,
falling asleep.
You totally fell asleep. When I read the Confessions of Augustine in seminary, because I was required to, which I'm sure you were too, it obviously did not impact you the way it impacted me.
No.
I must have had the flu at the time or something, but for whatever reason, I'm reading the Confessions of Augustine, I start vomiting, which is not really a pretty picture, but when I vomit, I end up in the hospital because I can't stop. So all I think of is, because he was so depressing, because all he did was talk about his sin, particularly his sexual sin. So he was just super whatever. Anyway,
So when they were like, why are you here? I'm vomiting because of Augustine?
Yes, that's exactly what I said.
I have Augustinitis. Anyway,
Totally.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So this idealistic or spiritual view was really made prominent by Augustine, which is why it became kind of popular. And basically, according to this view, the events of Revelation, as I said, are not tied to specific historical events. The imagery of the book represents the overarching good and evil throughout time and history. And so in this struggle, the saints are persecuted and martyred by the forces of evil, but one day they will be vindicated. But it kind of supersedes history.
Okay.
I feel like a guy named Robert Mounce summarized, I don't know who he is, Mounce. He summarizes the idealistic view really well. He says, Revelation is a theological poem presenting the ageless struggle between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. It is a philosophy of history wherein Christian forces are continuously meeting and conquering the demonic forces of evil. So it takes it out of a present reality.
So it's this present darkness, basically.
Basically.
I mean,
Frank Peretti.
Another throwback. Let's go.
That was when we were in middle school. That was a long time ago.
I'm like, dude, all these 80s references. Sorry in advance.
Okay, so those are the first two views: preterist, idealist view, or the spiritual view.
Okay.
The third view, which I think I can just say right now, I think is the least valid.
Okay.
is called the historist view.
Okay.
And it came from basically the Reformation. It came from Calvin and Luther and all those guys. And this view teaches that Revelation is in history. It is connected to the things that we go through, but it's a symbolic representation of events throughout history, not just those before 70 AD.
Okay.
And so this includes things like...
that there's always going to be a beast or always going to be a dragon kind of things throughout? Okay.
Or not always, but those beasts and stuff in Revelation represent more modern history. So things like the Protestant Revelation or Reformation.
Reformation.
The French Revolution.
Okay.
Rulers such as Charlemagne.
Okay.
And so most interpreters, when you look at the historist's point of view, place the later parts of Revelation, which we'll obviously get to at some point, in their time period.
Okay.
Or to come,
All right.
I guess. So this view rose up in popularity in the Protestant Reformation because during the Protestant Reformation there was a lot of concern about the Pope and the papacy. And so the beast was the Pope. However, this view started declining in the 20th century because the events are now past.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Right, yes.
Okay.
And now we have a new beast.
Yeah. And actually this whole viewpoint irritates me. And I think it's because Martin Luther and John Calvin and all those guys lived in Western Europe. So all the main events were through their cultural lens.
Right.
I mean, what about the East? What about Africa? What about...
Totally. Totally.
Okay. It's very selfish. Self-directed.
No, we have and that's going to be the theme of, I think, Revelation and its interpretation. So, but go on.
Did I just call John Calvin and Martin Luther selfish? Shh. Okay. Finally, the fourth view is interpreting Revelation as futuristic. Okay. And I would suspect that our listeners are most familiar with this view, whether they know it or not, because it's mostly American, or it started in America. Things like the late great planet Earth. Did you read that?
I haven't read it, but I'm very aware of Hal Lindsey and his work.
Hal Lindsey. You've already referenced, when I was a young person, my dad was an atheist, and I remember wrapping up for Christmas for him The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. I'm sure he loved that
Junior
Christmas
high conversion?
gift.
Well, yes, okay, got it. Yes.
You've already referenced the Left Behind series. So this is... these are the things that kind of summarize the futuristic worldview. And so it's necessary for us to talk about where that has come from as a theology, which is kind of heady, but we're going to get there. Okay. So are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
So this comes from the idea of dispensationalism.
What's that word?
Do you know what that is?
I just reference it from 7 Dispensations of Revelation. I think The Simpsons maybe said something about it. I think they made some reference to it, and that's how I know about it. And I was like, dispensation.
So dispensationalism is a theology, and it originated in the 19th century. So it is distinctly American because it originated through the teachings of John Nelson Darby. Does that name sound familiar?
Yeah, that name sounds familiar.
Okay. John Nelson Darby, his teachings, its growth happened mostly because of the publication of the Schofield Reference Bible, which was published in 1909. Did your parents have one of those?
I don't. My parents did not, but I heard about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So basically, Schofield Reference Bible is similar to our study Bibles today, but it was kind of novel back in the 1900s. Right. This guy, what he did was he put his study notes along with the Bible, and he printed it. So people started buying this, and he was writing from a distinctly dispensationalist perspective. And so you had commentary along with the book of Revelation, really for the first time ever. And so sometimes it's hard for us to distinguish as people between, study notes on something and the actual text. And so many educational institutions then at that point began popping up using this theology as part of their foundation. The very famous ones, Dallas Theological Seminary being the biggest, but others included Moody Bible Institute, Biola University, just up the street here, Talbot Seminary. Lots of influential pastors and teachers in the 20th century were dispensationalists. People like Billy Graham, Bill Bright, who started Campus Crusade for Christ, John MacArthur, all of them lived and breathed dispensationalist theology. So it's had huge impact. Right. What do you think about that? First of all?
Yeah. I mean, those are like the influencers of our grandparents and even in some ways our parents, and even and obviously in some ways us. So it's and they maybe don't say this is a dispensational view. It's just they're giving their view, and people are like, that sounds right, that looks right when I relate it to the world, and so it must be right. But,
totally.
Yeah. That's
so this
crazy.
futuristic understanding of Revelation, which is the one our listeners are probably most familiar with, has only been around 175 years.
Okay,
and
right.
it's distinctly American.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
So dispensationalist theology, because we haven't actually talked about what that is the understanding that it's hard to explain, and I'm not even sure I'm getting it right.
That's all right.
But that God has revealed it himself, or the God self, throughout history in different dispensations. And so you mentioned 7. That's probably the most common one touted,
right.
But there's disagreement on how many dispensations. But essentially that God...
My reference is The Simpsons, so I mean, that gives you...
Totally.
Yeah.
So that God has worked or in different ways or revealed himself in different ways throughout history. And this helps to us to understand why God acts different at different times.
Okay.
And so I think Christians have wrestled with the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. And
God of wrath versus God of love.
Totally.
And like
God
Jesus came to save us from God, right?
Exactly.
In a way.
So one of the ways to sort of make sense of that is to come up with this idea, well, God has revealed himself in different ways and different times. And so I'm going to explain in a second how that's different than what we believe. Okay. So based on how many, so basically, here's an idea. So this would say at the beginning of the Bible, pre-fall, God's dispensation would have been in innocence. Okay. That's how he revealed himself.
Okay.
And then post-fall, God revealed himself through conscience.
Right, because we became aware that we were naked and sewed fig leaves, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Then we have early on in the Old Testament, we see God revealing himself through human government. The judges.
Yep, the judges,
yep.
Kings, etc.
Yep. And then you see God as a dispensation revealing himself through promise through Abraham. And then you see it through the law of Moses, God as a dispensation. You see God showing up as grace in Jesus Christ. And then there's a future dispensation, most dispensationalists believe, that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
That is
because the Bible doesn't,
Correct. Which is found in the book of Revelation.
Revelation speaking to that.
So hold on to that for a second. Because
so Jude to Revelation, we're living in that time, basically. It's kind of a...
Right.
I mean,
and we don't yet know the
we
don't yet know the dispensation of God in that future reality. We only get hints of it. And that's primarily found in the book of Revelation. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So how this differs from what we believe as Reformed theology, which is Presbyterian and other people too, but is that we don't believe in different dispensations, that God is different at different times in history or revealing himself differently at different times in history. We believe in something called covenant theology, or that there's one covenant throughout Scripture beginning to end, and God maybe reveals himself differently in that covenant, but that covenant is continuous and consistent.
Right.
Okay? So that Jesus is the fulfillment of the covenant.
Right.
So for us, Revelation doesn't say anything new. It just reveals Jesus Christ.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So why this matters?
That's just a continuation of the story, where it's like this dispensationalist view is saying, no, the story's not quite complete yet.
Right.
And there is it's yes, but not yet. It's like now, not yet, that kind of, there is some truth in that, but.
Totally. So it seems kind of minor in some ways, but it's very major, the difference between dispensational theology and covenant theology.
Okay.
It is quite major when it comes to the book of Revelation.
Okay.
The most significant difference between the two is that this idea that there are two peoples of God, and this plays out in the book of Revelation. I don't know if our hearers are going to understand this, but covenant theology affirms that there is one people of God, just one. And this continuity between the people of God and the Old Testament, there is continuity between the people of God in the Old Testament and the people of God in the New Testament. So covenant theology sees a thread of meaning connecting those two books together, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. We are not waiting then, as I said, for any new revelation or dispensation of God. In dispensational theology, though, there is a distinction between Israel and the church.
Right.
And so that means that there are two people of God.
Two people, right.
Israel is for lack of a better way to look at it, is one of the is distinct as the descendants bloodline of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the blood descendants, the nation of Israel, you might call that. The church is the other, and it consists of all those and only those who are saved,
right,
or convert between the day of Pentecost and the rapture.
Who've accepted Jesus into their heart, even though that's not written.
Whether you're Jew or Gentile,
right.
You might cross over from the nation of Israel to the church. But part of the reason then for dispensationalist or this futuristic understanding of the Bible is part of the reason they have a timeline, and part of that involves a rapture,
right?
Which we'll get to later on.
Yeah.
For pre-tribulation, pre-destruction of the earth, or not destruction of the earth, but tribulation. Part of the rapture is to remove then from the earth the church, so that God can begin dealing with national Israel again.
Right. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Yep.
So those two things are separated.
Yeah.
And that's a big.
I'm having flashbacks. I'm seriously having flashbacks. I'm like, I totally get, because I remember having this kind of like, kind of feeling towards Jewish people, like not like anti-Semitic, but I just remembered kind of going, man, they missed their shot. And now the church is living out the will of God on this planet in a way. I mean, and it wasn't like this blatant, it wasn't like this hateful thing. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess they missed their shot. They don't believe in Jesus. They missed their chance. And so we are now, and there was always kind of this us, them. I always felt like there was this us, like Christian, them, Jewish. And like, oh man, like as you're talking, I'm going, oh yeah. And I remember hearing the talk about rapture, and like the church is going to be taken, and then God's going to deal with the sins. All, it's like, you missed your chance. I'm going to give you another chance to, years later.
So you can see how this would easily breed anti-Semitism.
Oh gosh, it's like scary. And I'm definitely not anti-Semitic at all, and I definitely never felt that. And so, but I can imagine, I'm like going, oh, okay, that's scary.
Yeah,
because I had some kind of filter that it went through, that it didn't go negative. I just was kind of like, oh, they missed the boat. That's a bummer.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until years later that you're reading about, I was reading scripture and the grafting of, in Romans, where the whole graft, and I was like, oh, like, no, Israel's still, they're still good, man. We're still, they're just, it's getting worked out differently, I guess.
Interesting.
In a way. That's kind of how I, came across it. Anyway, sorry, I was having like flashbacks there.
I get it.
Oh, man.
So the basic understanding of futuristic interpretation of Revelation then is that because it hasn't happened yet, there's a lot of speculation on what is going to happen. So there's a lot of timelines built on the book of Revelation, the basic one being that that the Revelation is focused on the end times. It has distinctive eschatological, that's a very big theological world, doctrine.
Right.
Particularly the doctrine of pre-tribulation rapture. So all the Christians will be removed. There will be 7 years on the earth. First 3.5, not so bad. Second 3.5, really bad.
Right.
You might have heard things like the mark of the beast, and then Christ will return. There'll be 1,000-year reign. I mean, there's different timelines for this, but you get the idea.
Yep.
Okay. And then eventually, the earth and the heavens and everything will be vindicated.
Right.
Right. Okay.
But we'll be in a new heaven and a new earth. It won't be the same one. Like, that's kind of how I understood it. It was just like, this one's just going to get destroyed and like into obliteration.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah,
we'll find out as we get in.
So N.T. Wright has a few things to say against that too. But
let's just recap then. That means the book of Revelation in a futuristic perspective becomes a literal future that is to come. The final dispensation and the interpretation of it then becomes incredibly important.
Right.
Okay. So we have 4 views that we've gone over. The preterist view, mostly history, prior to 70 AD, although some believe there's a little bit more to come. We've got the spiritualist worldview, which doesn't place it in history at all.
Okay.
We have the historist worldview, which was Protestant Reformation. Yes, it's in history, but mostly larger history and mostly pre-Reformation,
right,
or around that time. And then we have the futuristic, which is the newest, hasn't been around that long, distinctly American, based in dispensationalism. Right. How do you feel about those? Even before we continue, what do you think? You've kind of already interacted.
Yeah, the futurist is the one that makes the most sense, because that's the one that I've seen, lived out in my life or every day. So the other ones I'm kind of like, oh, okay, but. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about why that matters.
Okay.
Because the futuristic worldview.
Which one's right?
Well, we don't know yet. We're still getting there. That's what this podcast is for, right? We have to be right.
Way. What's the fifth one?
So the futuristic worldview, because it's primarily American, it was very influential in the 20th century, has had huge impacts on what's going on in our politics today and our culture. This is why this study matters. When I think that's what's important for our hearers to really know is this study absolutely matters because Revelation and the intersection of the world today is playing a large role in what you're seeing on TV,
right?
Especially in our elections, and whether you know it or not,
right.
Whether the people that are living it even know it or not,
right?
And it's primarily found in this understanding of Christian nationalism. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that. So I don't know about you, but January 6th, a couple years ago, I guess what year was that?
Last year.
No, that wasn't last year.
4 years ago.
2021.
3 years ago?
3 years ago. 3
Oh,
years
yeah,
ago
2020. Oh, yeah, not last year. It feels like it was last year, 2021, because we've talked about it. It seems like we're talking about it all the time.
It was a long time ago
2021.
now. Last election cycle. If you remember when everyone was storming the Capitol on January 6th, I think for me, watching it on TV, what was most disturbing about it was, as a believer, as a Christian, as a pastor, was all the signs saying Jesus saves and the crosses. And there was a lot of blessing happening over that event from a Christian perspective. And it was kind of disturbing to my soul because I thought, well, I don't relate to this at all as a Christian. This is not what I read in Scripture. And truthfully, that group of people, Christian nationalists in particular, have been heavily influenced by the futuristic interpretation of Revelation, whether they know it or not. And Christian nationalism, I just want to say, we're going to talk about in a second, in particular, it's not the same thing as patriotism. Okay? So work with me here.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to say, like, that feels like it would.
There would be
they're very confused if they.
Yes, but they're very different things. So I'm a patriot, meaning like I love my country.
Right.
I love my country. But when you love something, you also want to work to reform it.
Right.
Or, I love my children and I discipline them. Right. So being a true patriot is to work for love of country, right?
Right.
Christian nationalism is not the same thing. Christian nationalism assumes at its very core that America is chosen, that we are a chosen nation. And in fact, that America has sort of replaced the chosenness of Israel in the Scriptures. Okay? So work that out for me. So if you believe that our country is chosen, then everything that you do is to fight for really Christianity becoming the center of the cultural narrative. Right. And and you defend America on everything because you believe that we are the great hope, the light of the world. The light of the world, because you've been chosen by God. But we understand that Scripture, but no one else in the world understands that Scripture. That's kind of it. Like, that's what's so insulting about it. Yeah. It's like, so anyway, keep on. So then Christian nationalists then place themselves in the dialogue of what's happening in Revelation because it hasn't happened yet. Right. So the hero in Revelation then becomes almost like America. Right. And so we have to work really hard then in order for Revelation to come about because we want Christ to return. We want there to be peace on earth. We want all those things. We have to work really hard to get to move Revelation forward as a people then, as a Christian nationalist, in order to get these things done. So it interprets January 6th a little more clearly, that this is God's will, that because in a Christian nationalism, what's interesting about it is they don't believe necessarily in a theodicy. Do you know what that means? I've heard the word. You've heard the word. I know how to spell it. I know how to spell it. Yeah. So a theodicy is basically, I would say the Israelites in the Old Testament were a theodicy. Okay. So they had in power, a priest was basically over their community. Right. So a theodicy, they're not interested in having a priest over our country. That isn't necessarily what Christian nationalism is. They want our policies and procedures and us to be known as a Christian nation, though. Right. And so, whoever gets that done, they don't care. Right. So the values of the actual leader that gets that done isn't really important. Right. It's the fact that it does get done. Oh man. Yeah. Okay. So starting to get hot flashes again, but go ahead. Yeah. So in Christian nationalism, there is this unstated presumption that Christians are entitled, because they're chosen,
Right.
to primacy of place in the public square, and that they are the heirs of the true or essential heritage of American
When
culture.
I was a kid, that's why you could pray in schools. That's
Right.
why when they told you can't, it was like such a big, it's like, no, you can't.
Right. And I'm not saying, and I don't want to disagree that I don't, there are certain things about Christian nationalism. As a Christian, I would say, I would agree with that. You know,
Yeah.
I
For sure.
think we should be allowed to pray in schools.
Right.
But I think everyone should be allowed to pray in schools.
Totally.
Not just Christians. But they believe that, though, in Christian nationalism, Christians have a presumptive right to define the meaning then of the American experiment, because they see themselves as Americans' architects, their first citizens, and their guardians. Once again, though, they're not necessarily defending a theocracy, meaning the person in power doesn't need to be a Christian,
Right.
but rather they support any means necessary. So why we're talking about this is not all dispensationalists are Christian nationalists,
Okay.
but all Christian nationalists are dispensationalists.
Yep.
Do you get what I'm saying there?
Yep.
Okay. So because of that, this movement of Christian nationalism in our country, working out the book of Revelation from a futuristic perspective, is essential to our understanding the real book of Revelation, so that we can kind of, in some ways, correct the narrative.
Right.
Woo! What do you think about all that?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm just sitting there when you were talking about Christian nationalism, I just thought of, like, George W. taking democracy to the Middle East, right? And like that was like a big push. And I just was like, and then I was thinking about how I'm like, oh, that's more than just like taking a political system to the Middle East. You're like taking a whole different religion, Christianity and Muslims, you're trying to take Christianity into a Muslim world. And that's why it's like, that's one of the many reasons why it's not only difficult, but in some ways offensive, And I just remember I get democracy in other countries. I understand like giving people equal say and voice, and I totally understand that. But I remember always feeling like uncomfortable with us going over there and trying to establish it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more of that. It's like, how do we, I don't know.
That's what I think because I think we would certainly, stand behind, we want the world to know Christ.
Totally.
You know what I mean? That isn't.
And we want freedom and empowerment for all people and
Yeah.
politically as well.
I think where we would differ from Christian nationalists is the purpose in the world knowing Christ. I don't know, like for Christian nationalists, it's whether they acknowledge it or know it or not, it's because they're moving the book of Revelation. They're trying to move to Christ's return. If the world knows Christ, then Christ will return.
Oh, yes.
And it's a very different perspective than I want you to know Christ, or I want you to be in a relationship with God because it's changed my life.
Right.
And I want you to know peace, and I want you to know hope, and I want you to know all those things. It has a very different motivating factor.
Evangelism is a stat, not a person.
Right.
It's not a relationship.
Right.
I remember. Oh my gosh. It's like we gotta translate the Bible into all these languages so that the world can hear it, and then after that,
Christ will return.
Yeah.
So I think as we begin the study next week, the next podcast, we're gonna talk about reading Revelation from a genre perspective, which will blow your mind. Okay.
Keep it down.
But
keep it down.
As for this week, I think that's what we need to sit with. Okay. Just how relevant the study of Revelation is in America in particular. And it's important for us to understand Revelation as it is, especially as Christians, so that we can sort of, talk through or sort of understand what's going on in our American politics. Okay, so I think that's it for today.
Okay, so for our hearers and for those of you on YouTube, what's your interaction with Revelation? Where have you kind of, when did you first hear about it? What's your knowledge of it? And then of these four views, which ones do you kind of feel like has influenced you the most?
That's good.
Or which one have you kind of interacted with or influenced by the most? So
great.
Those are it. All right.
Great.
We did it. First one down.
We did it.
All right, we're now part of it. All right. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.